Okay, welcome back everybody from lunch. Very excited to introduce the next presentation here in a moment. Just a quick announcement for those that didn't hear it earlier. Tomorrow's workshop that's listed for Thursday in the CDAO track, the Fight from the Mock, that workshop is no longer happening. So just a heads up for folks that there will be no session or programming at that time. But with that, I want to introduce our next speakers that are focused on a few vignettes around the use of large language models. I think this is going to be a good follow-on to the session earlier today that looked at some of the different ways that the Department of Navy was getting after Gen AI. And so I'm very excited to introduce Edmond Kuqo and Peter Keach to talk about some of the research and some of the experimentation that they're doing in this space. So over to you.
Welcome, everyone. Appreciate your time today. We'll try to make it entertaining. We do have to spend, I would like to spend 30 minutes on the demonstration of what we've done when it comes to leveraging some of the large language models, or AI for some of you, that can be deployed in a manner that are disconnected. They're not solely integrated with like a SaaS solution like ChatGPT or Cloudy from Perplexity or Google's Gemini. And even though you still have that option, you will be in a position to then leverage and start thinking about how does your workforce and your teams can start innovating and being creative by leveraging some of what the open source and the industry has to offer to ensure that we support not just the always connected concept, but also in a disconnected manner. And when it comes to the Department of Navy and DoD, in the Department of Navy, we do have a lot of ships and subs that a lot of times they go underway for a period of time, and they are disconnected from the internet, and they need to still be able to operate and make sure that is value added to the warfighting in order for them to support the mission. The agenda for today, as you can see, I'm not going to go reading this word by word, but it is the overview. We're not trying to create a picture of what's right or what's wrong, what's better or what's worst. We do have some qualification criteria as to what constitutes a large language model and what does disconnected really means. A lot of the focus will be also in a cybersecurity perspective. How does one ensure how to risk assess a large language model and artificial intelligence? If you have questions about AGI, that's a different conversation. We're not there yet, but feel free to ask those questions if you have questions. Overall, most of you are familiar. If some of you are not familiar with the concept of open source and large language models, things that are currently hosted are through the OLLAMA library as well as the Hugging Face, which is an open source community. Some of them, some of the vendors like the Facebook and Google and Amazon and some of smaller companies are releasing some of these large language models that have been pre-trained with a data set and are qualified to then be released to the open source community, engineering community, to start testing, customizing some of these large language models, and also finding ways on how they can leverage and use them within their ecosystem, either being in an active threat monitoring, or if it's being in just a generic use for document processing, for image processing, or just a combined method or use case that includes all of the above, as I mentioned. It is important to note from a SaaS solution to an open source, because a lot of the open source is driven also by the community themselves, which kind of opens the door, a lot of the feedback and collaboration. SaaS solutions do offer high performance. They do offer, I wouldn't say better large language model than what the community does or offers, but they do have a lot more focus when it comes to actually training and releasing these patches and these large language models more quicker. From an open source perspective, a lot of the large language models, so I'm just going to refer that to LLM, so I don't keep bastardizing large language models if I say that multiple times fast. It does offer some level of transparency when it comes to, if you have full control to a large language model from an open source perspective, is that you control how that AI or LLM responds to your use case. You have the access to the system itself, and you can inform that large language model or that AI model that says, you respond to Edmond on this manner. Just recently, I was testing all the large language models on my kids because they wanted to use ChatGPT and take a test because one of them is remote. And finally understood why he was making A's 3 times in a row, because he was copy-pasting answers and putting on ChatGPT. So then I kind of disabled that access, and I just deployed a smaller model using Llama. But if I allowed Llama to respond completely like it was trained, it would still solve a lot of the problems. So then I had to instruct Llama via the system configuration that, hey, this is for my children. They're going to ask you questions. They are specifically for math, science, language. Do not answer the question, but help them come to the solution by asking them questions. Never provide a solution. One of them was able to actually creatively bypass some of this. So that goes back to the next one about the risk assessment as to how was he able to do that by like clicking fast on some things, which completely escaped me on how he did it. But that's what I wanted to make sure from a transparency perspective is important to note. From a SaaS, even though the vendors do their best to control and secure some of these large language models, they are catered to the larger audience. If I have a mission-specific thread, I have to now custom develop or custom train one of these models that is specifically for that area. Some of you are familiar with Retrieval Augmented Generative large language models, where you feed a bunch of documents, and then you can ask questions related to those documents, and then you get the answers you need, or you hope you get the answers you're looking for, because a lot of times the AI or the large language models tend to gas, if I may, right? And we'll go through that demonstration at the end to provide you guys some context. And this is the next slide, which already I segued into as to how does one risk assess a large language model? Do you look at the actual data? Do you look at the training data? Do you certify the people that train the large language model? Do you look at the algorithms? Do you look at itself, like once it's fully complete and trained and it's handed from a vendor to you and to be deployed in a secure facility on a disconnected environment? What about the data and the information that when a user copy-pastes your IP address space from your production because he or she is having a problem and their production keeps going down or using all your CPU resources, and that puts the entire log into your SaaS solution in this scenario, and all that information now is passed into their infrastructure. I don't have access to go and ask that vendor to go delete that because that was CUI or it was PII information. So that's why it's important for us collectively, specifically the folks on the cybersecurity side of things, how does one risk assess this? And by risk assess, I mean, is it low risk, is it moderate risk, or is it high risk? I don't want to deep dive too much into how we do an ATO and RMF 8510, 8531 for vulnerability assessment. But I wanted to kind of ask you folks a question first, and maybe somebody has a thought or a response, feel free to jump in. You don't have to come to the microphone, just speak your answer. But in your mind, when you say risk assess a large language model, what do you think comes first to your mind? Spot on. So a good starting point, right? It's not the only way, but I'm going to follow up with a question to you on the DeepSeek concept, right? That DeepSeek was also trained by a foreign nation, right, that has a specific agenda behind it. So if I ask a question like, hey, does your nation or state is bad or good, right? And you ask something specific, they try to be biased and provide you a good response. So now that's called context poisoning, meaning that the LLM can answer any questions and you need it to be as accurate as possible. But if it was trained in a subset of information that says, do not say anything bad about US or anything bad about China, it doesn't matter what you do to it, you'll never get what you're asking. So that's why it's important to note when it comes to transparency and risk assessment, you can look at the base model, that's one. Another scenario would be when the user inputs information into the model, they can copy-paste IP addresses, they can copy-paste some classified document, put it into that query chat window, and then send it on their merry way, and then suddenly that information gets stored. We don't know if that information is actually encrypted when it's sent out, or if it's only encrypted while it's sitting and is not encrypted when it's sent out. So that's another component. Another component is once the large language model was able to process your query based on the information that it was trained upon, now its own response can have aggregated information that previously could not have been a risk, but now the response from the large language model can insinuate some form of risk. So then the question becomes, do you copy-paste that information and dump it in a document and send it to your boss and says, hey, I answered your problem in less than 30 minutes. Now somebody gets that email and finds out that the aggregation of this information poses a risk to the larger mission. What happens? Like, how do you go and ask the vendor to now either retrain that model, disable some functions, or apply additional security controls that you shouldn't respond with PII information or financial system information? So that's why it's really important to think about from a cybersecurity and community perspective. There are different aspects. And then the last thing I wanted to focus on this component is there's also subjective interpretation. Just because I review a large language model and it says something like, this is good for Edmond, I assess based on this criteria, and then I'm going to toss this to Peter. And we've seen this over and over in traditional ATO process. Peter can get the package and review it with all of the risk assessed to that package and have a different perspective. We are also the raised policy owners on that, if you call that. What was one of our challenges that we saw when it comes to trying to approve an application, and then you went to another AO and they all said that that wasn't good enough?
Yeah, so it's subjective interpretation. I don't know if my mic's working. Okay, yeah, so the subjective interpretation, so when you get an answer back from that, it could be completely different from what someone else thinks the answer's supposed to be, and then so on and so forth, and exponentially get bigger. And that's one of the things when you were bringing up the risks of LLMs is, hey, it's all fine and great if you have the world's best LLM, the world's best data set, and all right, cool, hey, this is the answer to the problem. Well, if you don't know any context around that problem, you don't know if that's right, and there's no way, well, you got to be able to verify that you're actually getting the right answer back from that and not just taking it for gospel, if you will.
Yeah, and that's important. I wanted to emphasize that. As much as we automate and leverage large language model to support us and help us do our two-day job, and I'll be honest, guys, I have used Nipper GPT and ChatGPT. I'm a developer. Sometimes I go so deep into development that I realize that what ChatGPT has done for me has ruined my design, and then I spent 5 hours rolling back everything I just did, and then I lost track of everything that I meant to do at the beginning. So then I go to Cloudy AI, and I try to ask the same question, and it gives me a different standard and a different library. Then I go to Google and trying just to get a simple parsing something, and then I get caught up spending 3 hours figuring out which one is the best response. And the response sometimes, it's not because they don't have the whole context. And what I mean by the whole context is that if you copy-paste 10,000 lines of code and you put it in the large language model, it does not process properly if the large language model doesn't have enough context window in it to know what you give it and how to respond to you. So that's why it's risky to understand and being mindful about it. From a real-time monitoring, how do you monitor a large language model? You got the input criteria when a user asks something to the ChatGPT-like models, and then you also have the response aspect to it. Do you, like, if you have CUI information, or if you have a document that's only components of it or parts of it are CUI, how do you tell the AI that, hey, if you have this information, that's CUI, don't do anything with it, but the rest you can do something with it? It's really hard to articulate components and pieces of information that you wanted. Regardless, if a user is aware, they'll do their job, their due diligence. But if a user is not aware, not familiar with a lot of the classification information that we run in the Department of Navy and DoD wide, how do you distinguish what's CUI and what's not? Over to you.
So I don't know if you meant that to be rhetorical, but what I would do is in my RAG, I would add that to my metadata information, and I would filter it for my
Okay, so that's a good answer, right? Is that if you have, it goes back to that discussion between large language models as open source, where you have full control, right? And a SaaS solution where you actually don't have access to the metadata, right? To now tag it. Now, you can work with a vendor and say, hey, apply this, but that's one scenario and what is one system, so now you kind of impacted everybody else that it's okay with using some level of, information. So that's why it also becomes now a conversation of, can one large language model for the large audience solve everybody's problems, or should some of these models be customizable at the extent that if it's mission planning and you focus on data telemetry for, space or for satellite, then you train these models on that, and then you modify, as you know, that the metadata that says, hey, do not give location or information, GIS information, for this base over here, because I don't want anybody to know, just like Google Maps does with hiding some of that information. But good response on it. And the last thing I wanted to focus on this is the future-proofing. Large language models are a snapshot in time, and if you ask a question today, you say something like, when was last time your training data was based on? And you're going to get something like December 23rd, 2024. Well, if I want to use it for the future, how do I continue updating and retraining this model? And because we release so many policies and guidance and strategic intents every week and every day of the week, how do you keep up with the amount of change that it's occurring? At an average, an API or an application, major changes, I'm talking about, like backward compatibility and how you use it, changes every 90 days to 6 months. From a new version that deprecated half your work, it's probably like 6 months to a year. So if we continue using some of these large language models at the old or timestamp for which they were trained on, so now the question becomes, do you trust the information being responded to you? And is that information accurate and relevant to the today's mission in order for you to then plan that mission and take action upon it? So the future-proofing, it's not simply just a matter of risk assessing and how you risk assess a large language model. You also need to be mindful about, if I risk assess the model that was snapshot in 2024 in December and was good, and now I have to retrain it with additional information, do I do another risk assessment? Because is that a whole new thing, or is it only partially a new thing? So how do you actually now apply risk assessment? And what I mean by risk assessment, in a traditional method, we're talking about security controls, talking about CVEs and CWEs. Well, I can scan a file with a static analysis or a dynamic analysis that says you got a CVE because you're using Log4j. But how do I train that? Because that's just a token-based bunch of data. How do I know if it's a CVE or if it's a threat actor that had access and poisoned the context of the large language model? And now I'm asking it for apples, and it's giving me an orange apple back. It's still an apple, but this, the subscribing definition of it, it was already poisoned by someone else. So these are some things that, from a DoD perspective and Department of Navy, we're trying to assess and analyze to ensure that the guidance we provide to the larger community is cohesive, as well as it includes the open source community and the software as a service or solution as a service, whatever you call it in the SaaS concept. Now, this is another conversation. Again, we're the Navy. We got a lot of ships, a lot of subs, a lot of airplanes. We're talking about satellites, the Space Force as well. Pete had to remind me, I keep saying Navy, Army, Marine Corps, and Air Force. And I was like, we're good. And he's like, you forgot Space Force. So we got Space Force as well.
And Coast Guard.
And Coast Guard, thank you. So the question now is, how do I take a model and put it into something portable? Because I can't just go and cut a hole in my ship and put these huge, NVIDIA cards that are racks of servers. Because if some of you have gone underway in the ship, I'm not talking about the large decks, like the Harry Truman and all that, but like the small ones, I'm not sure there's enough room to put a room-sized blade in it, with HV100, the NVIDIA ones. So the question becomes, how do I leverage some of these large language models? At what capacity? And how can I use it in a disconnected manner? And by disconnected manner, I also need to look at it in a form factor. Like, how can I make something small enough, like an iPhone, so I can give it to my sailor when he's doing maintenance to one of these components in the ship? He doesn't have to drag a 3,000-page document with them, or a laptop for that matter, and then do Control F to find out where is the actual section on how much torque to put on this thread so then I don't mess it up. So trying to be able to now have this small factor of large language models being deployed into a disconnected manner. It can be a large language model. I don't want to get into the semantics about the parameters of a large language model. You got some that process like 8 billion, 100 billion, and then you get to like 400 billion, and then you get to the latest one, to your comments here, about DeepSeek, which is like 1 million plus tokens, which means that the context window for what we can process and respond to you is larger. It can make more reasonable responses based on the larger context. I can't really get something like 400 billion parameters and put it on Raspberry Pi because that requires a massive amount of memory to process and respond, because these models get loaded in the memory. So that's why we have to identify just specific open source or SaaS solutions. But again, the moment I say SaaS and then I say disconnected, I'm kind of stuck. So having open source models to create and become innovative and leverage them, it's important that we meet both criteria from an always connected and the disconnected. And some of these models are small factor. I think Apple is looking into, or somebody else trying to add, Samsung added an AI on their latest phone. So think about that. This is just another way of how do we leverage some of the open source, and if SaaS necessary, to support the disconnected capabilities that we have. The mission, it's either being from a SOP perspective, being on the air perspective, or being on the sea perspective. And the other piece about audit. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to look on the back, and when you ask a question to a large language model, and I'll demonstrate that in a few minutes, is that it will say that the user asked this question. But then the response from the large language model can be something it's lengthy or not lengthy enough. Is that question accurate enough for you to decide if you can use that information? But from a cybersecurity perspective, that response that's coming back to you, who decides if that response is actually risk adverse, as in acceptable to me but not acceptable to you? So now you put another filtering process or something else in between. And then to figure this out, you have to look at how you log this information. How much information do you log? How do you ensure that what's being produced by these large language models, it's safe and accurate in order for it to be considered mission ready? And for some of us, we might have a different understanding what mission ready definition is. From an XO operating a ship can accept the risk, but once it connects to the network and the enterprise, can the enterprise actually accept the same level of risk that an XO has just accepted? From a future state, you guys can read for yourselves here. I just wanted to open this up that we want to work closely with the industry and our partners to make sure and come up with these creative ways and innovative ways of, form factor is a challenge. Like, how do I reduce a large language model? How do I retrain a large language model? How do I use the cybersecurity? How do I create a set of standards that, just like we have for RMF, which is 8510, and NIST 853, that's a set of security controls that you say, if you want to be low risk for CIA confidentiality, integrity, and availability, you need to meet these 147 controls. Okay, now I got an ATO and I can deploy in production. For a large language model, how do I set those standards, right? At what level? Like, what is considered high-risk large language model versus a low-risk large language model? Well, if it was made in China, it's high risk, hypothetically. If it was made in US, it's low risk. Okay, well, if you reverse that conversation, if you're Chinese, from China, and say, hey, if I use a US model, that's probably bias, right, for a US, and then vice versa. So these are some of the conversations that if you folks have creative ways or innovative ways that can help us, feel free to reach out, and we'll be sitting down and have these conversations. DIU also is developing this called digital engineering. I don't think I can share very much on that because I don't need their classification. But this is another question, right? They're trying to figure out how do you risk assess, how do we future-proof, and how can we engage with the industry to help us develop some of these large language models in a continuous manner. Because the large language model, again, it's a snapshot in time until we get into AGI for artificial generative intelligence. from a regulatory and ethics, compliance perspective, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition rules, and the DFAR for the defense, and there, you got 8510, 8531, 853, 80218. You can, we like versioning and numbers. There is a lot of compliance and guidelines. From an ethical perspective, right? We have responsible AI, which DoD is now trying to develop enough structure to help some of the DoD components to follow some of these standards. So that's another area where we're trying to focus and trying to ensure that our models that we leverage are not just compliant, but ethical, and the information responding to the user is accurate to the extent for which it was trained upon. The tool that I've developed, and this is something on my spare time, with Pete, we get on call sometimes trying to understand what's the base case and what can we demonstrate today. So today what I would like to demonstrate to you folks is leveraging Ollama, which is a runtime server that you can load large language models, and then you can implement certain capabilities to do random, the RAG concept. You can do vision description when you upload an image, and it'll tell you what it sees. You also can ask general questions from a more generic. What this capability is trying to show today is simply leveraging the open source models, containerizing them into a small factor form, and then being able to then leverage the containers for, by definition, through OCI compliance, can be ported into different operating systems without necessarily saying, if you don't have an NVIDIA card, you can't run this large language model. So it knows how to balance based on parameters that you set during your development, that it says, if you're an Intel CPU, but you don't have an NVIDIA card, just use the CPU. It also trigger and tell you that if you're leveraging too much memory because the NVIDIA cards work better, and your CPU may not handle all these different large language models. So without the technologies I used, again, it's all open source. I'm using Spring Boot. I'm also using Java. Some of you might like something different. It's using containers, which is a Docker flavor. You can deploy it anywhere. I plan to release this to the government for the government consumption for their needs. If any programs out there are playing around with some of this, feel free to reach out to us. It's most likely to be on code.mil, which is a government-owned site. It offers a lot of other capabilities, as you're going to see. So that being said, let me jump to the demo, and then we'll go from there. Feel free to ask any questions in the process. If you can switch to my screen, please. So some of the capabilities that I was able to add to this application was it has a Stack Overflow-like feature there, so people can ask questions related engineering-wise or non-engineering-wise. It does offer a lot of the same features that Stack Overflow offers. It has like a services, almost like a service catalog or list where people have something they want to share. You can go into this, registry and register that information that it can be available to the entire public. This was catered for software factories and DevSecOps platforms, so that if a program has a set of requirements they want to leverage, agile methodologies and DevSecOps, they'll know on where to go and identify in the Department of Navy how many are there, what type of qualifications, is an impact level 2, 4, and 5. It's nothing to do with the large language models, but I just wanted to give you guys that's something that's available. The other piece is that, and the naming convention that I picked, it says Admiral AI, is nothing that's copyrighted. Nothing against our brothers and sisters, the Marine side of things. There was just something in my head that I was playing around with. The powerful thing about this is that at the end, as you can see, it's a Ollama that's running, which is the server, and it has all these processes. And if I go over here and I ask how many models I have on the background, it will show you that it has different models. And some of these models, just for awareness, guys, they do different things. They were trained to do specific things. Some of them look at the documents, they parse the documents, and they create these embeddings for searching criteria, specific criteria about that. You can download, because you can change also the location of where you put these large language models. You can use Hugging Face, you can use Ollama or some other library. You can just specify, it says, hey, pull this information. When it comes to disconnected environments, is that this is at a fully disconnect. As you can see, my Wi-Fi here is completely off. It leverages the already packaged or prepackaged models, meaning that you can leverage these in any disconnected environment anywhere, assuming that you got the appropriate authorization to leverage some of these large language models. So that being said, I'll just go back to the application. Another thing that is powerful, if I go to some of what the community has done, you can actually pick which one of these models you want to interact with today based on your needs. Some of them don't have the description labels yet because I haven't finished. But for example, if I go to the Llama 3.3, that has 74 billion parameters. Even though I have a really powerful computer, like 128 gigs of RAM here with a 46 CPUs from Apple, like the Max Pro, it will make my computer literally feel like it's lifting off because, for the sake of the demonstration today, I'm going to use the smaller one, which only has about 8 billion parameters, which is Llama 3.2. And Llama 3.2 was developed by Facebook and is open source under the MIT license. What you can see over here, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but temperature, it just tells the model, when you ask a question about a picture or something, it'll be very creative. It's just going to use its own reasoning based on the training data that was trained upon, and then give you a more, abstract response. But if you change the temperature to go to something like 1, it's just going to specifically stick to your question that says, what is the weather today in Charleston? And if he doesn't know what Charleston you meant, he's going to prompt you back and say, which Charleston, in Virginia or South Carolina? But if you leave it generic enough, he's just going to guess based if he knows which information, where you're at, and it will give you the weather or whatever you're asking. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute. SID is simply saying that if I ask the same question to you as a model, I need you to respond to me exactly with the same response. So if I say 1 plus 1 equals 2, I just need that. And if you change that, if you say 1 plus 1, it's going to try to explain that 1 plus 1 is a mathematical notation, and if you add another 1, you equals 2, and it just goes and it just gives you all the information if you want to learn math 1 plus 1. And the last piece is that this is really important, as I mentioned earlier. This is dynamically allocated, so what it does in the back end is reach into a Llama. It says, hey, which model did you load? Well, I loaded Llama 3.2, but what is its context window? And what that really means is how much information I can send to you to process. And an average, as you can see over here at the bottom, one text file that can be of size, let's say 1 megabyte. It's equivalent to 500 pages, which means it's about 62,000 tokens. And if I come over here and I put something like, let's say, 4,000 tokens, and I put a document that's large, it's going to parse that document and only going to take a small portion of the document, do something with it, and respond back to you. You're assuming you got everything in response. That's where it's important to know that depending on the size of the model you're running, the context you need to be ready to understand and define what that looks like. So for that being said, I'm going to just ping this at a certain level. And I know I can upload large files over here because I was able to mess with it. But I did, let's say, we'll put something simple here. Raise. This is a policy that we developed for the Department of Navy, which leverages CI/CD risk assessment, like pipelines, that you can leverage these pipelines to do risk assessment and then being able to deliver a capability, not on average 2 years for an ATO, but in less than 30 days, if you meet some of that criteria. And if I ask a question related to, hey, what is raise specifically, it's going to take this document, parse it, do all of the necessary information when it does, and then it's going to try to get your question and then respond to you in a generic form. And you can always pause this and stop it. Now, if I go over here and I change it, and I say, hey, keep it 0, the default, and I set the temperature to 1, and I ask the same question, what it's going to do is, I didn't enable this. Another thing I wanted to emphasize on this, folks. So this is a feature that some of the large language models, when you go to ChatGPT, you say, hey, it knows what you're saying. And this is very important. Large language models by design can't remember anything. You can ask a question, but it's just that one-time thing. But if you enable a capability on the back end that says, remember the conversation you're having at a certain threshold, and if that threshold passes the size of this context window, then it's going to lose the memory. It doesn't know. If you ask for the weather, I don't know, let's say, 120,000 tokens before, and now you go back and say, hey, what was the first question that I asked you? It's just going to go to the cutoff memory and says, I don't know anything about weather. You haven't asked me anything about weather. And that's important, and this is when I wanted to emphasize this with the risk assessment. So I'm going to go back to the chat history, and this is just the back end. So if some of you folks look at this and says, my session probably expired, but let me just refresh this. This is what I have asked my large language model here. It says, what is DODI 8510, which is the RMF cybersecurity risk assessment framework? And then it responds back, I cannot provide information on a document that I do not have access to because it thinks it's CUI. So then I went back and says, can you look into your own data that you were trained upon and then give me that response? And then he goes and says, after searching the knowledge database, and by knowledge meaning the information that this was trained upon, and this is where this is important from a cyber risk perspective. If you train these models, and if you tell this model that do not respond to the user with anything they ask about any classified information, you first have to define what is classified information and what is considered classified in terms of the data tagging, labeling, and all that. But I'm going to ask you guys a question. What do you guys see wrong with this picture right here when it comes to risk and cyber and anything else? This is the database you're looking at. I'm sorry?
You're selecting everything. You're pulling from all sources. You're getting all data.
So go a little more like, what do you, from a risk perspective, not from a system perspective, yes?
If you could reprogram it and say, no, it is okay to provide that data that you've been trained on, then you could essentially pull that data back out.
So that's another point. Anybody else? So this is readable text. That's your information that I'm reading as the DBA, as the database administrator on the back end, right? So if a threat actor gets access to this information on the database, I know exactly about your mission, how you did it, what you planned, because I can extract, pull this information out. So this is important. When I mentioned earlier, this data, I left it unencrypted for that very same reason, so that when a user inputs a criteria to a large language model, if it's a SaaS solution, when we risk assess them, we need to ensure that they actually encrypt this information on the back end, meaning when it sits there in the database. On the same time, when this information is pulled from the large language model, it has to be decrypted, parsed, and then sent back to the user. Again, good responses from you guys. I wanted to see a little more kind of outside-the-box thinking is that this is information that if this is not my information, and it can be social security numbers, mission planning from an active threat, or anything. And sometime if it's a financial system, if I'm looking with DeepSeek, which is Chinese-made, the admins have access, and if it's not encrypted because I don't have access to it, and it's a SaaS solution, now I'm in a really bad position as to my information, who has access to my information. And can that information then be shared with the partners or anybody else? A lot of you also have seen when you log in or sign up in a website that say you need to read the SLA. Just raise your hand. How many of you do actually read the entire SLA when you sign up on a website? Right. So I can share all this information now with anybody I want. Right? So that's why it's important. I'm not saying you guys should read the SLAs because they make those SLAs so painful that you read the first 3 pages and you're like, I'm done with this thing, whatever. Everybody got my information anyways. So back to the application. I want to show the other capability. Another feature that we were able to leverage on this is that Retrieval Augmented Generative. So what this usually does is that you can upload a document. As I mentioned earlier, this is a different model than what I used on the Llama. You can't ask Llama to parse your documents in a meaningful way so you can search based on those documents. There are specific models that can parse text, and there are specific models that can look at an image and make sense, a reasonable response to an image. So that's why some of these large language models are different in size, in context, and they do different things. When you see ChatGPT, you see things like they have multiple options there. I mean, go over here. You can see you can attach a file, you can attach an image, you can attach a report, and it'll parse it. But in the back end, what they call them is mixture of models, or MOEs. It leverages multiple models, and it sends the right information. I can send information to a model that says, look at this file, extract the information, take that file, send it to this model, make some sense to that information, extract that information, send it to a large language model to then respond to the user. This is called what they call them mixer of models and MOEs of experts that ensures that what you get at the end is something that you need. Going back to the random, I did upload a couple of documents. I'm going to upload a random document right now just for your pleasure here. That's for the search criteria. Let's see. I don't know what that is. I don't want to upload something. Well, let's go back to the Raise. This is I think I have Raise uploaded, and I don't want to mix this up and mess up the demo for you guys. But let's find something else here. Cyber Awareness Challenge, and I'm going to. And in government, if you're in government, you know what that is. If you're not in government, is that every year we have to test ourselves if we are cyber secure from a theoretical perspective, right? So I'm going to upload this document. As you can see, if we go over here, you can see all the documents that I have uploaded, and I have a table that says RAG here. Here we go. And that was the Cyber Awareness Challenge, right? So the model was able to parse this information and store this information. Now, be mindful about it. This is unencrypted data. Once I trigger the flag that says encrypt this information, you won't be able to read any of this information. And one more question when it comes to encryption and decryption, folks. What is the impact to the system when you encrypt and decrypt things? Is it performance issue? Is it risk issue? What is it?
All the above, actually.
That's a good response, right? It's just like now when it comes to user experience, every time you encrypt and decrypt things, especially to large language models, there is an impact to it, like from a user experience, from a response time. Going back to that, I'm going to ask it a simple question, right? I did upload the CNO nav plane, the Chief Naval Operations nav plane, earlier because it was about 75 megs, and when I tried it over here, it kept timing out, and I was kind of pulling my hair. So last night I uploaded in a better Wi-Fi. I tried to use my hotspot, but that didn't work. So I'm going to use the same model again. I'm going to ask a question as to what are the most critical components about the nav plane. And then, as you can see down here, you can do a full document search or a section document search, which means if you have large documents that are like hundreds of megabytes large, as I mentioned earlier, 1 megabyte has about 500 pages, right? And it's about 62,000 tokens. So anything that goes over that 1 megabyte, you're going to start thinking about very beefy, powerful machines that can run these large language models. But for like small factor, you try to start thinking about leveraging smaller sizes, and you can break those files further down. If I now use some of this, I'm going to increase this to the largest that the model can handle, and I'm going to do a full document search. So what this will do is that I'm going to go on the database, pull the document specifically, load it in memory, get your question, ask the question, process it, and then respond specifically. And you can say things like, that only, because what happens, and this is a risk that you folks need to be aware, if somebody gets access to your system and uploads additional information that's not relevant but kind of similar to what you're trying to ask questions to the large language models, it's called context poisoning. You are poisoning the context so that when the response comes back to the end user, it's not, I wouldn't say accurate, because you got to be mindful about large language models. Accuracy is not their flavor of the day. But it's important that what you receive back, you need to check your facts before you send that to your leadership or people that you're dealing with as a response to their inquiry. So if I ask that question, if this document is pretty large, and I should not have done that, I should have done the section. So if he fails, that's a live demonstration, guys. I apologize for that. But it's going to take a minute to do this. So while he's doing that, I'm going to open another tab, and I'm going to go to the next piece while he's trying to respond on the back. It's a vision model. So this is, again, another model, and you can see this is called Llama 3.2 Vision. It has 11 billion parameters. What this does, it can actually take a picture, like if you have a mission planning or a GIS map or some kind of map that it's large or it has multiple formats or different things, you can feed into the large language models, and what the model can do is then take this, abstract the information, and again, be mindful about what information you ask. So let's say I'm going to make my kid proud today. I'm going to go here, and we went in a trip. He had never seen a chicken, so when I showed him what a chicken looks like, and he got it on his hands, first he freaked out what it is. Let's see, describe details what this is. and it's going to go on the background. Let's see if this one responded. Okay, so this is responded. So what you can see over here is that rather than reading 50, 60 pages document and trying to like remember what the first subject said, you can come over here and leverage some of this large language model and say, hey, just give me the key important notes, right? And as you can see here, Project 33, distributed maritime operations centers, and warfighter competency, right? And it goes in detail, and it tells you also where the source came, right? So if I use the model like it is, it wouldn't give you any of this information. So I'm going to switch to my IDE for a moment for some of you folks here. Okay. This just froze, and it froze. So much for Mac and the wheel of death. So I'll go there. It'll probably process. So this is my kid holding a, a rooster, and he was very excited about it. I don't know if it was excitement or he was terrified of it. It's one thing, but you can ask questions, right? So it talks about, and this is important to note. My kid is between that age, as you can see, right? So based on the information that was trained online and all of that, this is local, so I can do and ask anything. At the very least, if I don't like it, and if I see this model is really scary, I can just go over here and say, you know what? Delete that model, because I don't like it. And it's just gone. Like, it has no access to it. Now, you can wrap some of this information with an administrative access, where it says that only the admin can delete this. But again, the power of open source and controlling it is that I can do what I want with it. And hopefully the ID is responded. It's not. Let's see if we can kill this, because I wanted to show you guys something really important there, is that you can go to the model on the back end, on the system level, to the metadata, and instruct that it says, you should only respond in this manner, period. So it doesn't matter what you tell the model, you always get that response. If it's cybersecurity, or if it's PII information, or if it's a mission planning, and if anybody says for a specific coordinate, like where is this location located, it's going to give you generalized perspective and say somewhere between New York and South Carolina. Well, can you give me more accurate information? Sorry, I can't offer that information. Now, there are accurate and there are smart people that can actually, and this was something early with ChatGPT where people will call them jailbreak the models. And this is another thing about risk assessment. You can control them and secure them at a certain threat, but also there are people that can jailbreak them, meaning that they can override some of these instructions you've given to these models. And in reality, what happens is that now they're fully open, and they can respond to any inquiries, any information that they got stored in the database that can be critical to the mission. That information is available to you for use. Wow, okay. This does not like me today, but no, the models are all loaded, but that was the picture earlier. As you can see, it described accurately the age. It talks about what it sees. It says multicolored tie shirt, size, and all that. And at the end, I wanted to make sure this is something that I explicitly told the model. So you need to tell me about the inference. Even though it's an optional, I want to make sure that I inform the user what does that mean and where it came from. And it just infers. By inferring, it's simply saying that this is what the AI thinks it is. And it provides information as far. Now, I can also add information that says, make sure to also tell the user that this is not 100% accurate information. Hypothetically, you can measure whatever that means. And the other piece I wanted to offer, that's something I'm very passionate about and curious about, is we know that vulnerabilities are bane of our existence when we deliver a capability. Let me check on the time. We got another 10 minutes. We have advisories. KEV is the CISA's knowledge base where they store all the most active CVEs and CWEs. As you can see over here, there is a lot of these. I have 1,252. What this does, it reaches directly into the KEV database and pulls that information, and he has a cron job that runs in the back end and refreshes. You can click on any of this, and it'll give you details about what is CVE, who's the vendor, in this area it says Ivanti, and if evidence. Evidence means, is it being active, being, used, or is not active? Somebody knows of that. And it was discovered, let's see, the latest I got here is on the 23rd, which was it 4 or 5 days ago?
Yeah.
And this is Sonic Wall, which is another, firewall and the switches and all that. And another piece is the GitHub. This is another advisory where they have a lot of their, and their latest, it was on the 28th. And look how many CVEs alone were discovered on the 28th. So there is also the NVD, which is the National Vulnerability Database. They also have on the 28th a lot of these discoveries. The reason I show this is that what the large language model, the power is that you can leverage some of these models. You can copy, say, I want to use this model. Let's see, I want to attach a file that has all these CVEs. I think I have a sample file right here. Here you go. And what it's going to do is going to parse this information and all the CVEs. I have instructed the large language model on the back and told it that for each CVE, I want you to give me a recommendation, a code fix, and a mitigation if possible. And if not, don't just wander and give me your opinion, because I don't care about your opinion, right? Just give me factual information for which I can use. And then here, I also wanted to make sure that I don't just want to use one bias response from the large language model. I wanted to make sure you can ask your own question. So it will take the system. But remember, the system message takes priority over the user message, because the user can ask anything crazy, and we don't want the system to respond based on what the user, but it needs to take it under consideration within the constraints for which we, the author or the owner of that large language model, put upon it. And if I ask that question right now and I say, let's say, as a cybersecurity expert, and assess the following CVEs and provide mitigation and fixes. And if I just post this, in the back end, what the system does, parses the file, sends it to the large language model, figures it out which one of the CVEs has a mitigation or not. The power of this is that you can also connect this to the internet if it doesn't find another information. But what it's doing on the back end, for some of you folks, is that it's leveraging a lot of these APIs and this information from GitHub, from Kev, from MVD. It's parsing all this information, mashing it together, sending it to the large language model. The large language model then is able to use the most accurate information. And this is near real-time information. So now you have a mixture of these models, one that parses the file, one that searches the internet, one that mixes all these things together, and then hopefully the response is back, because it's pretty quick. Here we go. So it takes each one of these CVEs and says, hey, as a cybersecurity expert, I'll assess, and this is the instruction we gave it, each CVE and provide actionable recommendations. As you can see, 2020, 2757, it gives you a summary, and this is all the instructions that I have given it in the back end. I say, this is the exact response I need you to give for every single CVE. No response in content, but the formatting. So people on the training aspect, because training is important for the end user, they will always have this very same response. And if you don't like this, you can go on the back end, you tell the system message to change it on how you want the response, and it'll respond back to you. And he had 4 CVEs in there, as you can see, or 5, 6, 7. How many did I have on that? Let's see, deny this. And they all had that similar answer. Let's say 2022-5083. It says mitigation, remediation. Update to the latest version of Java SE, use secure coding practices. Oh, so now I got my ID responding. Sorry about that, guys, I'll go back to it. But while at it, this is what I was trying to refer earlier. This is what a system message looks like. Some of you guys are, and if you can read it, I apologize for that, but let's see. System, right here. This is for, you are an AI assistant specializing in providing accurate, contextual, relevant, and actionable information. And then he says, I need you to give a source priority, need you to give a clarity and concision and concise response, actionable guidance, and source transparency. So I can come here, delete all of this, or just disable this function, and then the large language model is going to be at its own mercy. Whatever it was trained on is going to respond, and if you ask the same question by different users, it's going to give you different answers based on whatever information, whatever he has loaded in the memory at any given time. So this is what constraint. If somebody gets access to this, they can change this, and this context poisoning again, and now the responses that it provides, it can open the door for any responses or requests that the user has. Going back to that previous response from a CVE perspective, this is important because if I'm using like a CI/CD pipeline and I have 2 people on my cybersecurity team, I have 500 customers that are running 500 pipelines at once, each of them has like 10 CVEs, these 2 guys cannot accommodate the necessity and the quantity that they need to respond to every CVE. And as we know, a lot of applications in the Department of Defense are legacy in nature. So when they go through these automated tools, they find a lot of vulnerabilities. How do I mitigate them on time? Now I have to go on Google, get on Stack Overflow, search if I can find a solution, or if I'm lucky, I got an SLA with a vendor to give me that fix. So it's a lot of time spending. What this is powerful is that, don't take this for gospel by any means, but you can feed that pipeline directly into this large language model by passing like a JSON payload that has all the CVs, any format. It will just know what it is. And then use large language models. You can train those large language models. You can systematically ask them to respond in a certain manner, or you can go as further as, if you trust that model, to go in your code, and I think Cursor AI is a really good tool if you guys want to mingle around with using large language models and how to do auto-completion. You can update your code automatically and then compile it and package it and send it in its merry way. So that being said, that's kind of, you can also do a manual if you just have one specific CVE. You can ignore certain things and certain thresholds, but that being said, we got 5 minutes. I want to give you a few minutes, folks, to ask some questions. This is important. It's going to, again, I'm going to plan to open this up to the government at some point once I accurately have this information. Yeah, yes, sir. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, come to the mic, please. Sorry.
Great talk. A lot of great topics. The question I had, I saw in each of your use cases you were selecting the models. Have you guys looked at the feasibility around consensus AI, where you're using multiple models simultaneously relative to the context windows and those kinds of things? What are your thoughts around that?
So it's a really good question, and to that extent, so if I go over here, this is when I load a model and when I change those models, and users can change and prefer different models based on the different responses to his question, is that each of these models has different context window. Each of these models can respond differently within this context window. So trying to assess and analyze, it's really important that when you are an acquisition authority and you're trying to purchase a large language model or some solution that offers a large language model, be mindful about the requirements that you have when you purchase. If a SaaS solution offers and gives you that, that need, then go with a SaaS solution. If you need a disconnect that is something more controlled, that you want to control the destiny of the environment, then to his question is that you need to be able to articulate clearly which one of these models, what context window, what is the large size and the parameter size, how much can I customize it, and the form factor, can I deploy this in a small device or requires a large device? To do this, a lot of times the acquisition authority needs to involve some of the folks that are familiar with a lot of what we've discussed today. So to be honest with you, I'm not sure there is an accurate response to like doing that analysis per se, but it is the most critical important step to take action on as an acquisition person, a program. Before you purchase something, work with your engineering teams, work with the subject matter experts that have that experience. And be honest, guys, if somebody says I'm an expert on AI, it's only been 2.5, 3 years, so I'm not sure there is an expert in AI just yet, but there are smart people that have a lot of experience with it. I might be wrong with that statement by any means, but because it's an ever-evolving door, right, and new models come out every day, there is always a risk that somebody says, I'm an expert, trust me, this is a good model for you. Do your due diligence and your homework and go from there. Hopefully that kind of gave you a little context. I think I saw another hand, Zamir. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so, yeah, you got it. Oops, thank you for that. He's on my team as well. So.
Yeah, I just took, because, you're there, you got AirDrop. I'm going to AirDrop you a screenshot of your vulnerabilities for the app, so maybe you could show them how to, or look up one of the CVEs on the model itself.
Appreciate it, yeah, if you have it.
Let me drop it for you.
Yeah, so his comment is in relation to my comment earlier that how do you risk assess a model and how do you scan for a CVE or CWE, which is the vulnerability for a model? Because it's a static thing. It's just like something that gets loaded in memory, and you can scan it, but how do you respond to it? Yep, he's got a question. Oh, I'm not connected, Zamir, so.
Great
talk. Thank you, sir.
Something to consider, and wondering if you thought about it as well, is for disconnected ops, including taking into consideration inference and digital reasoning for the efficiency of the CPU usage while disconnected. I think that's another area we'll need to consider to go along with data aggregation and some of these other considerations. Also, the amount of inference or digital reasoning used for a specific task. And,
No,
yeah.
spot on, and that's really important. I'm glad you brought that up, is that in a lot of different ways when it comes to disconnected environments, right, it's the form factor, right? If you have a large deck sheet, you can have something more powerful to run more powerful models. If you're in a small deck, or if you're in something like an airplane that you want to put something like the size of my fist, right, you need to be mindful about not just the size, but the inference component of it, like how does this model actually respond to this type of mission information, and how does it translate that information so that when it responds to you is meaningful. Now, that can be a constraint because when it comes to inference, one can say, because a small model doesn't really have good output or to your response. If it's a larger language model, like in size from a context window, the inference component of it, like how does it know what's right or wrong or how to respond to you in a fashion that you asked. So that's why it's kind of, it's important, very important, but depending on your mission requirements, if it's the inference component that's more critical to you, then you make those analysis. And if it's just the size component to it, right, then that becomes also pragmatic.
Yeah, and I think it's also a cyber risk as the inference based on future models could determine the user and ultimately hallucinate or provide bad data as a bad actor.
And it completely skipped my head about the hallucination part. I know it's a thing on hallucination, and we all do it at some form or factor. But models tend to hallucinate a lot, and I should have gave you, just recently, Pete and I were asking a question to a few of the models, says 1 + 1 = 3, and I'm 100% sure on that. And then we respond back and say, go back and forth, no, it's not, oh, yes, it is. And then suddenly just give up and say, you are correct, 1 + 1 = 3, right? So this is something that we're, and another one had to joke, and I'll stop. He said, my wife says 1 + 1 = 5. And the model said, no, it's wrong. He was like, wait, so you're calling my wife wrong? Do you want to tell my wife that she's wrong? And he's like, no, I agree with you. If you want to talk to your wife, if she's right, she's right. So, you know, these are things that you got to be worried about when it comes to inference, right? Assuming that what the response is, it's at the user's discretion. So be mindful when you use, when you procure, when you purchase. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. Again, our plan is to put this model at code.mil at some point. We have a little more work to do. But leverage open source AI and large language models. Talk to us if you have small form factor that we can leverage, like handheld devices, or into small factor, like the small laptops and things of that nature. Keep in mind the constraints you brought up, that if they're too large, I can drag a HV100 around with me, because in the ship, I don't have the capacity to do that. You worry about hitting your head and all the pipes running above you. So thank you very much for attending today. Appreciate your patience with me, and looking forward to engage with some of you folks in the near future. Have a good day.